The old clock on the hospital wall showed 8:30 a.m. when Robert walked through the glass doors of the VA Medical Center. His worn leather shoes squeaked softly against the polished floor as he made his way to the front desk. At 73 years old, Robert had learned to move slowly and deliberately. His body reminded him every morning that his best days were behind him. The young receptionist barely looked up from her computer screen when he approached. "Name and appointment time?" she asked in a tired voice that suggested she had already processed dozens of patients that morning. Robert gave his information and was handed a plastic number. "Take a seat, they'll call you when it's your turn." The waiting room was packed with people of all ages. Some were young men and women in their 20s and 30s, still carrying themselves like soldiers even in civilian clothes. Others were middle-aged folks dealing with injuries that had caught up with them years after their service ended. Then there were the older veterans like Robert, the forgotten generation who had served in a war that most people preferred not to think about anymore. Robert found an empty chair near the window and settled in for what he knew would be a long wait. He pulled out a manila folder that had seen better days. The edges were worn soft from years of handling, and the contents inside represented decades of fighting with government offices and insurance companies, medical records, service documents, letters from doctors, and forms that never seemed to lead anywhere. It was all there in his tired old folder. As he sat there, Robert caught his reflection in the window glass. The man looking back at him seemed like a stranger sometimes. His hair had gone completely gray years ago, and his face carried lines that told stories he rarely shared with anyone. But it was his eyes that bothered him the most. They held a weariness that went deeper than just being tired from a restless night's sleep. People walked past him without a second glance. To them, he was just another elderly man taking up space in a government building. They saw someone who moved slowly, someone who needed help opening heavy doors, someone who fumbled with modern technology at the check-in kiosks. They didn't see the young soldier who had once been faster and stronger than men half his age. Robert rolled up his sleeve slightly and looked at his left forearm. There, faded but still visible, was a tattoo he had gotten more than 50 years ago. The ink had blurred with time, and age spots had appeared around it, but he could still make out the design that had once meant everything to him. It was a reminder of a time when he had mattered, when his skills and courage had made a difference in ways that most people would never understand. The morning news was playing on a television mounted high on the waiting room wall. The sound was turned down low, but Robert could see images of current conflicts overseas. Young soldiers in desert camouflage gear, helicopters kicking up dust clouds, and politicians giving speeches about supporting the troops. It all looked familiar yet foreign to him, like a movie he had seen before but with different actors. A group of younger veterans was sitting nearby, talking quietly among themselves. Robert caught pieces of their conversation, mentions of deployment, rotations, advanced equipment he had never heard of, and benefits programs that didn't exist when he came home from his war. Their world of military service seemed so different from his own experience, even though he knew they shared more than they realized. One of the young men glanced over at Robert and nodded politely before returning to his conversation. It was a small gesture, but Robert appreciated it. Most days he felt completely invisible in places like this. People looked through him rather than at him, as if his age had somehow erased his relevance to the world around him. Robert remembered when he first started coming to VA hospitals in the early 1970s. Back then, the buildings were different, the staff was different, and the attitudes toward veterans like him were definitely different. He had learned quickly to keep his head down and not expect too much. The country he had served wasn't exactly throwing parades for soldiers returning from Southeast Asia, especially soldiers who looked like him. The folder in his lap contained documents that told only part of his story. There were discharge papers, medical evaluations, and benefit applications, but nothing that captured what it had really been like. Nothing that explained the weight he still carried in his chest when he heard helicopters overhead, or why certain smells could transport him back to places he would rather forget. His wife had understood, at least partially. She had been patient with his quiet moods and sleepless nights for nearly 40 years of marriage. When she passed away 3 years ago, Robert lost the only person who knew how to reach him when the memories became too heavy. Their children lived far away now, busy with their own families and careers. They called on holidays and birthdays, but they had never really understood what their father had been through or why he sometimes seemed so distant. The waiting room began to fill up as the morning wore on. Robert watched as people came and went, some looking relieved after their appointments, others appearing frustrated or worried. He had been through this routine so many times that he could predict which offices would run on time and which ones would keep patients waiting for hours. A maintenance worker was replacing burned-out light bulbs in the ceiling fixtures. The man worked methodically, moving his ladder from spot to spot without paying attention to the people below. Robert found himself studying the worker's movements, the way he approached each task with practiced efficiency. It reminded him of his own work after the military, when he had spent decades in jobs that required precision and attention to detail, but rarely received recognition. After leaving the service, Robert had worked in construction, manufacturing, and eventually building maintenance. He had been reliable and skilled, the kind of employee who showed up early and stayed late when needed. But he had also been careful to keep his military background to himself. In those days, being a veteran of an unpopular war wasn't something that helped you get ahead in civilian life. The years had blended together after that. Work, family responsibilities, paying bills, and trying to build a stable life that didn't involve thinking too much about the past. Robert had become good at compartmentalizing his experiences, at keeping his military service in a separate box that he only opened when absolutely necessary. But now, sitting in this waiting room surrounded by younger veterans who seemed more connected to their military identity, Robert felt a strange sense of displacement. These men and women wore their service like a badge of honor. They talked openly about their deployments, their units, and their experiences. Society had changed its attitude toward veterans, at least somewhat, and these younger soldiers had come home to a country that at least tried to show appreciation for their sacrifice. Robert's appointment was still an hour away, according to the digital display board near the reception desk. He settled back in his chair and let his mind wander. Sometimes he wondered what his life might have been like if he had served during a different era, or if he had been born with different colored skin, or if he had made different choices when he returned from overseas. But those were dangerous, thoughts that led nowhere productive. Robert had learned long ago that dwelling on what-if scenarios was a luxury he couldn't afford. The reality was that he had served his country during one of its most controversial conflicts, had come home to a society that didn't know what to do with veterans like him, and had spent the subsequent decades building a quiet life that didn't draw attention to his past. The waiting room was starting to feel stuffy, and Robert considered stepping outside for some fresh air. But he knew that if he left, even for a few minutes, he might miss his name being called and have to reschedule his appointment for weeks later. So he stayed put, occasionally shifting in his uncomfortable plastic chair and watching the steady stream of people moving through the hospital corridors. A young woman in military uniform walked past, probably active duty based on how crisp and new everything looked. She moved with confidence and purpose, clearly comfortable in her environment. Robert found himself wondering what her story would be, what challenges she would face when her active service ended, and whether the country would remember her contributions 20 or 30 years from now. The morning sun had shifted position, and now it was streaming directly through the windows where Robert sat. The warmth felt good on his face, and for a moment he could almost imagine he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere peaceful where time moved more slowly, and the weight of memory didn't press quite so heavily on his shoulders. But the illusion was broken when his name was finally called over the intercom system. Robert gathered his folder, stood up, slowly, and made his way toward the corridor where his appointment would take place. As he walked, he rolled his sleeve back down to cover the faded tattoo on his forearm. It was a habit he had developed over the years, a small act of self-protection that had become as automatic as breathing. Behind him, the waiting room continued its steady rhythm of people coming and going, each carrying their own stories of service and sacrifice. Robert didn't look back as he disappeared into the maze of hallways that would lead him to another routine medical appointment. Another small step in the ongoing process of managing the long-term consequences of choices he had made when he was young and believed he could change the world. 26-year-old Alex Rodriguez had been sitting in the same VA waiting room for nearly an hour. His appointment wasn't for another 30 minutes, but he always arrived early for everything. It was a habit drilled into him during his years as a Navy SEAL, where being late could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. Alex tried to focus on the magazine in his hands, but his mind kept wandering. The headaches had been getting worse lately, and the ringing in his ears never seemed to stop completely. 3 tours overseas had left their mark on him, both visible and invisible. The doctor said it was all related to that IED blast in Syria 2 years ago. But Alex sometimes wondered if his body was just catching up with all the punishment he had put it through over the years. He looked around the waiting room, taking in the mix of veterans from different generations. It was something he always did instinctively, a habit formed during years of assessing environments and potential threats. Most of the people here looked like they were dealing with their own challenges, their own battles with bureaucracy and medical systems that moved too slowly. Near the window, Alex noticed an elderly black man sitting alone. There was something about the way the man carried himself that caught Alex's attention. Even sitting in a plastic chair in a government building, the older gentleman maintained perfect posture. His shoulders were square, his back straight, and his hands rested calmly on a worn manila folder. It was the kind of bearing that Alex recognized immediately. Military bearing that never really goes away, no matter how many years pass. Alex found himself studying the man more closely. The gentleman appeared to be in his 70s, dressed in clean but well-worn clothes that suggested he took care of himself despite limited means. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, and his shoes, though old, were polished. These were the details that Alex had been trained to notice, the small things that told stories about a person's character and background. As Alex continued his observation, something on the man's left forearm caught his eye. The older gentleman had his sleeves rolled up slightly, and there was what appeared to be a faded tattoo visible just below his elbow. Alex leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look without being obvious. Military tattoos were common among veterans, and Alex had learned to read them like a form of identification. What he saw made his blood run cold. The tattoo was old and faded, but Alex could make out enough detail to recognize what he was looking at. It wasn't just any military tattoo. It was something specific, something that made Alex's heart start beating faster. The design included crossed arrows and what looked like a lightning bolt, but it was the additional markings around the main design that really caught his attention. Alex had spent countless hours studying military history, particularly the special operations units that had paved the way for modern forces like the SEALs. His grandfather had served in Vietnam but never talked about his experiences, leaving Alex with a burning curiosity about that generation of warriors. He had read every book, watched every documentary, and studied every declassified document he could get his hands on. The tattoo on the elderly man's arm wasn't just a regular Army Ranger's insignia. It was something much more rare and significant. The additional symbols around the main design indicated membership in one of the most secretive and dangerous units of the Vietnam War. Alex recognized the markings as belonging to MAC-VSOG, a classified special operations group that had conducted some of the war's most perilous missions. Alex's hands began to shake slightly as the full implications of what he was seeing hit him. MAC-VSOG veterans were incredibly rare. The unit had suffered massive casualties during the war, and the nature of their missions had been so classified that many never received proper recognition for their service. The operations they conducted were so dangerous and secretive that some historians considered them the predecessors to modern special operations techniques. As a Navy SEAL, Alex had studied MAC-VSOG operations during his training. The tactics, techniques, and procedures developed by these Vietnam-era special operators formed the foundation of everything Alex and his teammates did in the field. Cross-border reconnaissance, deep penetration raids, prisoner snatches, and psychological operations, All of these modern special operations concepts had been pioneered by units like MACV-SOG. Alex tried to process what he was seeing. According to everything he had read, there were fewer than a dozen confirmed MACV-SOG veterans still alive. These men were living legends, warriors who had operated in the shadows during one of the most controversial periods in American military history. Their missions had been so classified that many details were still redacted in government documents, even decades after the war ended. The elderly man sitting across from him wasn't just another veteran waiting for a medical appointment. He was potentially one of the most elite soldiers of his generation, a member of a unit that had written the playbook for modern special operations. The techniques Alex used in Syria, Afghanistan, and other classified locations around the world could be traced directly back to innovations developed by men like the one sitting 20 feet away from him. Alex felt a strange mix of emotions washing over him. There was excitement at potentially meeting a living legend, but also a deep sense of respect and almost reverence. He had always wondered what it would be like to meet one of the operators who had laid the groundwork for everything he did as a SEAL. These were the men who had proven that small teams of highly trained soldiers could accomplish missions that conventional forces couldn't even attempt. But there was also sadness in Alex's realization. This man, who had likely risked his life on missions that officially never happened, was sitting alone in a VA waiting room like any other aging veteran. There were no crowds of people asking for autographs, no reporters wanting to hear his stories, no recognition of the incredible sacrifices he had probably made for his country. Alex knew enough about the Vietnam era to understand why this might be the case. Veterans returning from that conflict hadn't received heroes' welcomes. Instead, they had faced protests, discrimination, and a society that wanted to forget about the war as quickly as possible. For Black veterans, the challenges had been even greater as they returned to a country still struggling with civil rights issues. The more Alex thought about it, the more ashamed he felt about his own generation's lack of awareness regarding these earlier special operators. Modern SEALs, Rangers, and other special operations forces were celebrated in movies, books, and media coverage. They were treated as heroes by most of American society. But the men who had pioneered their techniques and tactics had served in relative anonymity, their contributions largely forgotten or classified beyond public recognition. Alex realized he was staring and tried to look away, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he had discovered. Every instinct told him to approach the elderly gentleman and introduce himself, but he wasn't sure how to do it appropriately. How do you walk up to someone and ask if they were part of a classified unit from 50 years ago? How do you express the kind of respect and gratitude that Alex felt building up inside him? The waiting room continued its normal rhythm around them. People came and went, nurses called names over the intercom, and the general hum of a busy medical facility provided background noise to Alex's internal struggle. He kept glancing over at the elderly man, trying to build up the courage to approach him while also trying to figure out what he would actually say. Alex thought about his own service and the brotherhood that existed among special operations forces. There was an unspoken bond between warriors who had faced similar challenges and dangers, regardless of when or where they had served. But this situation felt different. This wasn't just meeting another veteran. This was potentially meeting someone whose contributions had directly influenced Alex's entire military career. The young SEAL found himself studying the man's demeanor more closely. Despite his age, there was still an alertness in his eyes that Alex recognized. The way he occasionally scanned the room, the way he positioned himself with a clear view of the exits, the way he maintained awareness of his surroundings. These were all habits that Alex shared, ingrained behaviors that never really went away once you had served in certain types of units. Alex's medical appointment was still 15 minutes away, but he couldn't concentrate on anything else. The magazine in his hands might as well have been blank pages. All he could think about was the possibility that he was in the presence of one of the warriors who had helped create the special operations community that had given Alex's life purpose and meaning. As he sat there wrestling with his emotions and trying to decide what to do, Alex felt a profound sense of connection to military history that he had never experienced before. It was one thing to read about legendary units in books or watch documentaries about their exploits. It was something entirely different to potentially be in the same room as someone who had actually lived that history. The elderly gentleman shifted slightly in his chair, and Alex caught another glimpse of the faded tattoo. There was no doubt in his mind now about what he was seeing. The question was whether he would have the courage to act on this incredible opportunity, or whether he would let it slip away like so many other moments of potential connection between generations of warriors. Alex took a deep breath and made his decision. Some opportunities in life were too important to ignore, regardless of how nervous they made you feel. This was one of those moments that could change everything, not just for him, but potentially for the forgotten hero sitting across the waiting room. Alex's heart was pounding as he stood up from his chair. His legs felt unsteady, not from any physical weakness, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Walking across a waiting room shouldn't feel like preparing for a mission, but somehow, it did. Every step toward the elderly gentleman felt significant, like he was crossing a bridge between two different eras of military history. Robert was looking out the window when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned slightly and saw a young man in his 20s walking toward him with purpose. The young man had the build and bearing of someone in the military, broad shoulders, confident posture, and that particular way of moving that suggested years of physical training. But there was something else in his expression, something that looked almost like nervousness mixed with deep respect. "Excuse me, sir," Alex said softly, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to sound calm. He had faced enemy fire in 3 different countries, but approaching this elderly veteran felt more intimidating than any combat situation he had ever encountered. "I hope I'm not bothering you, but I couldn't help noticing your tattoo." Robert looked down at his forearm, then back up at the young man standing in front of him. It had been years since anyone had paid attention to the faded ink on his arm. Most people his age didn't even notice it anymore, and younger people usually didn't understand what they were looking at. "Yes, son," he replied cautiously. "Got it a long time ago." "Why do you ask?" Alex took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. How do you tell someone that you think they might be one of the most elite warriors of their generation? How do you express decades of accumulated respect and admiration to a complete stranger? "Sir, I believe you served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, specifically with Charlie Company 3rd Battalion, is that correct?" Robert's eyebrows raised slightly. It was unusual for someone so young to recognize the specific unit markings, especially ones that had faded as much as his tattoo had over the years. "That's right," he said slowly. "But that was more than 50 years ago. How would you know about Charlie Company?" "Sir, I'm Petty Officer Rodriguez with the Navy SEALs," Alex said, unconsciously straightening his posture as he introduced himself. "I've studied military history extensively, particularly special operations units from the Vietnam era. Your tattoo. It's not just Rangers, is it?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Robert studied the young man's face, looking for signs of what this conversation might really be about. In his experience, when people started asking specific questions about his military service, it was usually because they wanted something from him. Disability benefits information, war stories for a school project, or sometimes just someone to listen to their own problems. But there was something different about this young SEAL. His questions were too specific, too knowledgeable to be casual curiosity. And the way he was looking at Robert suggested that he already knew more than he was letting on. "What exactly do you think you're seeing, son?" Robert asked, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge. Decades of keeping his mouth shut about classified operations had taught him to be careful about what he revealed to strangers, even well-meaning ones. Alex felt his mouth go dry. He was about to ask a question that could either create an incredible connection or completely offend this elderly veteran. "Sir, I believe those additional markings around your Ranger tattoo indicate service with MACV-SOG. Am I correct?" The effect of those words on Robert was immediate and visible. His entire body seemed to freeze, and his eyes widened in a way that suggested Alex had just mentioned something that wasn't supposed to exist in polite conversation. For several long seconds, neither man said anything. The sounds of the busy waiting room continued around them, but it felt like they were suddenly in their own private bubble of shared understanding. "How in the world do you know about SOG?" Robert asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That designation hasn't been mentioned to me in over 40 years. Alex could hardly believe what he was hearing. His research had been correct. He was actually talking to a MACV-SOG veteran, one of the most legendary and secretive units in American military history. The young SEAL felt like he was meeting a living piece of history, someone whose contributions had shaped everything Alex did in his own military career. "Sir, I've spent years studying the origins of modern special operations," Alex explained, his voice filled with excitement and reverence. MACV-SOG operations became the foundation for everything we do today. The techniques, the tactics, the insertion methods. Everything my team uses in the field can be traced back to innovations developed by your unit. Robert looked around the waiting room, suddenly aware that other people might be listening to their conversation. "Son, maybe we should talk about this somewhere else," he said. "Some things aren't meant for public discussion." But Alex was too excited to stop now. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think you understand what this means to me. My grandfather served in Vietnam, but he never talked about it. I've always wondered what it was like for your generation, what you went through that we never learned about in school." "There's a reason we don't talk about it," Robert replied, but his tone was softer now. He could see the genuine enthusiasm and respect in the young man's eyes, and it had been so long since anyone had shown interest in his military service that he found himself wanting to continue the conversation despite his instincts for secrecy. Alex sat down in the empty chair next to Robert, moving closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. "Sir, I need you to understand something. In our training at Coronado, we study historical special operations missions. We learn about deep reconnaissance, cross-border operations, small team tactics. All of that came from units like yours, but they never told us that any SOG veterans were still alive." For the first time in decades, Robert felt a strange sensation in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize what it was: validation. For 50 years, he had carried the weight of missions that officially never happened, operations that couldn't be discussed or acknowledged. He had been part of something extraordinary, but the classified nature of the work meant that very few people would ever understand what he and his teammates had accomplished. "What exactly did they teach you about SOG?" Robert asked, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Alex leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "They taught us that MACV-SOG conducted some of the most dangerous missions of the entire war. Cross-border reconnaissance into Cambodia and Laos, prisoner snatches, psychological operations, direct action raids behind enemy lines. The casualty rates were classified, but we heard they were higher than any other unit." Robert nodded slowly. "Higher than they had any right to be," he said quietly. "We lost a lot of good men." "Sir, the missions you conducted saved countless American lives," Alex continued. "The intelligence gathering, the disruption of enemy supply lines, the rescue operations, modern special operations doctrine is built on the foundation that you and your teammates laid down." For Robert, hearing these words was like having someone finally acknowledge a lifetime of service that had been invisible to the world. He had spent decades wondering if the sacrifices made by his unit had been worth it, if their missions had actually made a difference in the larger scheme of things. The young SEAL sitting next to him was providing answers to questions that had haunted him for 50 years. "You really study this stuff?" Robert asked, still somewhat amazed that someone so young would know so much about his old unit. "Every chance I get," Alex replied. "Sir, your generation wrote the playbook that my generation follows. The techniques for small unit operations, the methods for operating behind enemy lines, the protocols for extraction under fire, all of that came from what you learned in Southeast Asia." Robert felt something shifting inside him, like a door that had been locked for decades was finally being opened. "It's been a long time since anyone called me sir because of my military service," he said with a slight smile. "Most people don't even know I served." "That's wrong," Alex said with conviction. You and your teammates should be celebrated as the founders of modern special operations. Instead, you're sitting in a VA waiting room like any other veteran, and most people have no idea what you accomplished. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Robert's name being called over the intercom system. His appointment time had arrived, but for the first time in years, Robert didn't want to go. He was finally talking to someone who understood the significance of his service, someone who could appreciate the weight of the experiences he had carried alone for so long. "I have to go," Robert said reluctantly, gathering his manila folder. "But this conversation, it means more to me than you could possibly know." Alex stood up as well. "Sir, would it be okay if we continued talking after your appointment? Have so many questions, and I think there are things you need to know about how your service influenced the next generation." Robert looked at the young SEAL for a long moment, seeing something in his eyes that he hadn't encountered in decades. Genuine respect and admiration for what he had done in uniform. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten existed. "I'd like that very much, son," Robert said. "I'll be back in about an hour." As Robert walked toward the corridor where his appointment would take place, he felt lighter somehow, as if a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying had suddenly become easier to bear. Behind him, Alex sat back down in his chair, his mind racing with the incredible opportunity that had just presented itself. For the first time in 50 years, Robert felt like someone truly understood what he had been through. And for Alex, meeting this living legend was about to change everything. He thought he knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. When Robert returned to the waiting room an hour later, he found Alex exactly where he had left him. The young SEAL was reading something on his phone, but he looked up immediately when he saw the elderly veteran approaching. There was an eagerness in Alex's expression that reminded Robert of his own younger self, back when the world seemed full of possibilities and every mission felt like it could change everything. "How did your appointment go, sir?" Alex asked, standing up respectfully as Robert approached. "About as well as these things usually go," Robert replied with a slight smile. "Lots of questions, not many answers. But I'm more interested in continuing our conversation from earlier." The two men walked outside together, finding a quiet bench in a small garden area behind the medical center. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and the relative privacy gave them both a chance to speak more openly than they could in the crowded waiting room. "I've been thinking about what you said," Robert began, settling onto the bench with a small grunt. "About how our old missions influenced what you do today. I have to admit I never really thought about it that way." Alex pulled out his phone and showed Robert a photo from his last deployment. "Sir, this is my team in Syria, right before a mission that was almost identical to operations your unit conducted 50 years ago. Same insertion methods, same communication protocols, same extraction procedures. The only difference was the equipment." Robert studied the photo carefully, seeing in these young faces the same determination and brotherhood that he remembered from his own team. "You really do the same kind of work we did?" "The same and more," Alex replied. "But sir, here's what you need to understand. When we were training for these missions, our instructors told us that the techniques were developed by the best special operations unit in American history. They just never told us that any of you were still alive to thank." Over the next hour, Alex shared stories from his own deployments while Robert listened with growing amazement. The young SEAL described missions that sounded remarkably similar to operations Robert had conducted in Cambodia and Laos, but with technology and support that his generation could never have imagined. "We had GPS navigation, satellite communications, and air support that could respond in minutes," Alex explained. "You had maps, radios that barely worked, and sometimes no backup at all. Yet you accomplished missions that we study as perfect examples of special operations." Robert felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. For the first time in decades, someone was telling him that his service had mattered, that the risks he and his teammates had taken had contributed to something larger than themselves. "There's something I need to tell you," Alex said, his voice becoming more serious. "I've been in contact with some people since our conversation this morning. Word travels fast in the special operations community. Robert raised an eyebrow. What kind of word? The kind that says there's a Macy VSOG veteran sitting in a VA waiting room, and nobody in the current special operations community knew he existed. Alex paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Sir, would you be willing to meet with some of my teammates, and maybe some of our commanding officers? The question caught Robert off guard. He had spent 50 years avoiding attention, keeping his military service quiet and staying out of the spotlight. The idea of suddenly being thrust into conversations with active-duty special operations personnel was both exciting and terrifying. Why would they want to meet me? Robert asked. Because you're a living piece of history, Alex replied. Sir, there are colonels and general officers who have spent their entire careers studying the operations you participated in. There are young operators who train using techniques that you helped develop. You're not just a veteran, you're a founding father of modern special operations. Over the following weeks, Robert's life began to change in ways he never could have imagined. Alex introduced him to other SEALs who in turn connected him with Rangers, Special Forces soldiers, and Marine special operators. Word spread through the tight-knit special operations community that one of the legendary MAC VSOG veterans was alive and willing to share his experiences. The first formal meeting took place at a Navy base near Robert's home. Alex had arranged for a small gathering of special operations personnel who wanted to hear first-hand accounts of the missions they had studied in textbooks. Robert was nervous as he walked into the conference room, but the reception he received was unlike anything he had experienced in his entire life. 20 active-duty special operators stood up when he entered the room, not because they had to, but because they wanted to show respect to someone whose contributions had shaped their entire profession. The commanding officer, a Navy captain with more than 20 years of experience, approached Robert with something that looked very much like reverence. Sir, it's an honor to meet you, the captain said, extending his hand. Your unit's operations in Southeast Asia saved American lives and established principles that we still follow today. Robert shook the man's hand, feeling overwhelmed by the level of respect being shown to him. I was just doing my job, he replied quietly. Sir, with respect, you were doing much more than that, the captain responded. You were pioneering techniques and tactics that became the foundation of everything we do. The cross-border reconnaissance methods, the small team insertion procedures, the communication protocols under fire, all of that came from your experiences. The meeting lasted 3 hours, with Robert answering questions about missions he hadn't talked about in decades. The young operators listened with complete attention as he described operations that had only existed in classified documents and training manuals. For them, it was like having a historical figure come to life and share stories that had shaped their professional development. But the real transformation happened in Robert himself. As he talked about his experiences, he began to see them through different eyes. The missions that had haunted him for decades suddenly took on new meaning when he understood how they had influenced generations of warriors who came after him. Sir, there's something we'd like to present to you, the captain said near the end of the meeting. He handed Robert a custom challenge coin that had been made specifically for the occasion. On one side was the MAC VSOG insignia, and on the other were the emblems of all the current special operations units that traced their lineage back to his era. This coin represents the bridge between your generation and ours, the captain explained. It acknowledges that everything we accomplish stands on the foundation that you and your teammates built. Robert held the coin in his hands, feeling its weight both physically and emotionally. It was the first official recognition he had received for his service in over 50 years, and it came not from politicians or bureaucrats, but from the warriors who had followed in his footsteps. The changes in Robert's life continued to accelerate. Alex helped him navigate the VA system more effectively, ensuring that he received all the benefits and medical care he deserved. Other veterans organizations, learning about his story, invited him to speak at events and share his experiences with younger service members. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the relationship that developed between Robert and Alex. The young SEAL became a regular visitor, bringing other operators to meet the man who had helped write their professional playbook. Robert, in turn, found himself with a renewed sense of purpose as he shared lessons learned from missions that had been classified for decades. "You know what the best part of all this is?" Robert asked Alex during one of their regular conversations. "For 50 years, I wondered if what we did mattered. I wondered if the sacrifices my teammates made had any real impact on anything. And now?" Alex prompted. "Now I know that every mission we ran, every risk we took, every brother we lost, it all contributed to something bigger than we ever imagined. You and your teammates are living proof that what we did made a difference." 6 months after their first meeting in the VA waiting room, Robert was invited to speak at the Navy SEAL training facility in Coronado. Standing before a class of young operators who were just beginning their special operations careers, he felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for decades. 50 years ago, my teammates and I were running missions that we thought nobody would ever hear about, he told the assembled trainees. We operated in the shadows, took risks that seemed impossible, and lost friends whose names will never be on any memorial wall. But we did it because we believed it mattered. He paused, looking out at the young faces staring back at him with complete attention. Today, I'm standing here talking to you because one young SEAL had the courage to approach an old man in a waiting room and ask about a faded tattoo. That conversation changed both of our lives, and it reminded me that the brotherhood between warriors transcends generations. Robert's story became a reminder to the entire special operations community about the importance of recognizing and honoring the veterans who had laid the groundwork for everything they did. His experience also demonstrated that sometimes the most meaningful connections happen in the most unexpected places, like a VA waiting room where two warriors from different generations discovered that they shared more than just military service. They shared a commitment to something larger than themselves, a willingness to sacrifice for others, and a brotherhood that connected them across 50 years of history. In recognizing Robert's contributions, Alex hadn't just honored one forgotten veteran, he had strengthened the bonds that held the entire special operations community together. And Robert, who had spent decades feeling invisible and forgotten, finally understood that his service had mattered more than he ever could have imagined. The tattoo that had marked him as just another aging veteran became a symbol of honor that connected him to a new generation of warriors who understood exactly what it represented.